how do you ascend to the Lord's presence? How do you get to his presence? Hi everyone, welcome back. This is Reality of Jesus. My name is Simon. Glad to have you back. So today I'm going to talk about the way to Mount Zion. How to ascend to Mount Zion. How to ascend to Mount Zion. I'm a little excited. This is something I'm very passionate about. Talking about you can tell I'm a little excited. So anyway, Mount Zion is God's presence, where God dwells. That's Mount Zion. How do you ascend to the Lord's presence? How do you get to his presence? And how do you dwell there? Because when you talk about getting into God's presence, it's not something we ought to do once in a while, once a day, once a month, once a year during Christmas. No, it's a place where we dwell, where we ought to dwell. That's what Psalms 91 says, those who dwell in the secret place dwell. And I'll get to that in a minute. It's not about getting there, but we also have to ask ourselves a question: how do I stay there? So those are the two things I'm going to address today. How do you get in the Lord's presence, and how do you stay there? So there's a verse or a few verses that I love. So I'm going to be reading from Psalms 27 from verse 4, and later I'm going to read I believe Psalms 24. So Psalms 27 verse 4, here's what it says: I have asked one thing from the Lord, and this is my desire, to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, gazing at his beauty, inquiring in his temple. I'll read it one more time. I have asked one thing from the Lord, and this is what I desire, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, gazing at the beauty of the Lord and inquiring of him in his temple. So I want to highlight a few words from those few verses. The first one is desire. So it says, I have asked one thing from the Lord, and it is what I desire. So one of the most important things when it comes to being in the presence of the Lord is desiring to be in his presence. It seems obvious. It sounds obvious. The first thing we have to do if we are seeking to ascend into his presence is to desire to be in his presence. It's very difficult for us or for anyone to be in someone's presence where we don't even want to be there. It's like we've been forced in that person's presence. It's very difficult for us to connect with someone who we don't desire to connect with. It's almost impossible. So if we want to really connect with God and be in his presence, then the first thing that we ought to do is to desire his presence. Desire his presence. That's why David is saying, there's one thing that I've asked from the Lord, and this is what I desire. It's a desire that he has. So the first one is desire. The second one is, once you get there, our goal should be to dwell there, not to pass through, not to pass by, not to go in and come out, but to dwell there. To dwell is like to live there. Your primary dwelling is where you live primarily. So our goal when we desire to be in his presence is not just to feel his presence for a few seconds. It's not just to hear him for a few minutes. No, it's to stay in that mode of being in his presence. That should be our desire, to dwell in his presence. And then the third word is gaze. Gaze. I looked up the meaning of the word gaze. English is my third language, literally. So sometimes I like to look up words even when I think I know what they mean, because sometimes when you look at the actual meaning of the word, it kind of drives in you can get the full meaning of the word. So gaze it means looking steadily and intently, looking at something or someone steadily or intently, especially in admiration, surprise, or thought. looking at someone or something steadily and intently, especially in admiration, surprise, or thought. You know, when I read that meaning every time, I think about being at awe of God. You know, so once we get into His presence, it's all about gazing at His beauty. And the Lord is beautiful. And when I talk about beautiful, or when the Bible talks about gazing at His beauty, we're not just talking about His physical beauty. He is beautiful, but we are not just talking about physical beauty. We are talking about God as a whole, Him as a person, His character, who He is, you know, His heart, His intent, His desires for our life. Just being there and being at awe of God, of who He is as God. One thing that we all know is that there's no single person who has fully known God. And that is because God reveals Himself to us slowly by slowly, but even with that, we never fully know Him. So He has many layers. Unless you desire to be in His presence, unless you get in that presence and dwell there, unless when you dwell there you're gazing at Him, then there are aspects of Him that you will never know. Just like being friends with someone, unless you spend a lot of time with someone, there are things you'll never know about that person. There are people who know me as Simon because they see me probably on YouTube videos, probably because they've seen me, we've worked with them, see me probably somewhere at church, or we met at someone's place and they say hi, I introduce myself as Simon. So there are people who know me superficially, but there are those people who know me very well. They know how I speak, they know my character, my personality. They know more details of who I am. There are those friends who you just say hi to each other. You have nothing against each other, but you just say hi when you meet, like in church, or once in a while when you meet in a gathering, you say hi, you're good, but you don't know much about them, and they don't know much about you. Yes, they are, you can call them friends, but they're not intimate friends. The Lord is the same. Unless you get really intimate with Him by desiring to be in His presence, by dwelling and living in His presence, and just by gazing at Him, paying attention to Him, absorbing who He is, then there are some things of God that you will never come to appreciate. There are some things of God that will never be revealed to you, and there are some aspects of Him that you will never learn. So there are some things that you'll not know about Him unless you spend time with Him. Just the way you can have friends who know some things about you, but not everything about you. But you can have other friends who know more about you than others, because you guys have spent more time together. It's the same thing with the Lord. Someone may spend a lot of time with the Lord. They'll have more revelations of who He is. They'll have more revelations of the posture of His heart, His desire, His long-term desire for us as part of His creation. So you get more intimate details of who He is. But if you do not spend time in His presence, then you just know Him as God, but without any intimate details. And that's why it's important to spend time to desire to be in His presence, to dwell in His presence, and to gaze at His beauty, His character, to think of Him, who He is, who He says He is, to read the Word, meditate on the Word, and just be open for Him to just reveal Himself. The other thing I was going to talk about is there's that part that it says, so it says, gazing on the beauty of the Lord and inquiring Him in His temple. Another version uses that word seeking Him in His temple. So those words are written in an active form. So it's something that it's an active verb, meaning it's something that's continuous. Inquiring of Him is interacting with Him. So when you're in His presence, when you get in that presence, then you can interact with Him. You can inquire of Him. One of the things that really stood out to me when I read, this was a couple months ago, I read the book of Samuel and I believe Kings and Chronicles, those chapters. This was mainly on the story of David. One of the things that I really noticed, especially when after he was anointed as king, one of the things that I I really picked up on was how he was dependent on God. And every time he faced a challenge, every time he was going to battle, even when he had won the last battle, before he went to battle, he would say, I will inquire of the Lord. Let me inquire of the Lord. Let me do, before I do this, let me inquire of the Lord. Let me get into God's presence and get his heart, his mind concerning this issue. And that really challenged me. That even the small things that you'd think of him being a mighty warrior, being that he was very a strong guy and he had won many battles, that going to one more battle he would say, I've won many battles, so I know I'm going to win this. No, each and every time he would go back in God's presence and inquire of him, ask the Lord, should I fight, should I go to battle with these people or not? And that's very humbling, and it shows humility and where he had positioned God in his life. That really challenged me. So when I read here, and this psalm is written by David, and just seeing his life being told by someone else and seeing him here, I can make the two connections and just understand the importance of being in God's presence. That when you are in his presence, then you can inquire of him. And that's the important thing, and that's one of the things that we don't talk about often. Let us desire to be in God's presence, because once you are in his presence, other things that we struggle with, they are taken care of. It's in God's presence that our provision is provided. It's in God's presence that our fears are resolved. It's in God's presence that those things that we're struggling with are addressed. It's in God's presence where we get protection. Psalms 91 says, those who dwell in the secret place, they will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Those who dwell in his presence. So being in his presence, then everything else you're dealing with can be resolved from his presence. But sometimes we avoid going to his presence because we want to address a few things. No, I'm too busy in life right now. I really don't want to do much about God. I'll pray once in a while, but right now I'm very busy working, trying to save. We avoid his presence, trying to solve our problems out there. What we don't know is everything we face can be solved by being in his presence. Okay, I don't want to go too much into that. I don't want this video to be too long, but when you're in God's presence, he covers you. He covers you. And this coverage is not just protection. No. Every challenge you face, every problem that we face in this life, every challenge we face, that can be addressed in his presence. But when we avoid that presence to pursue and try to solve these problems for ourselves, then we end up running round and round and round and round and round. And finally, we'll have to come back to God and say, Lord, I've tried this. It hasn't worked. Now help me. Once you show him that you got it, you have it under control, you can do it, you have the strength to do it, he stands back. He never forces himself on anyone. So he lets you do what you need to do. He knows you'll come back. And he's a gracious God. Once you come back, he says, okay, now I'll help you. He always makes a way. So, quick review. So, desire to be in God's presence. Once you get there, dwell there. Don't pass through, pass by, in and out. Dwell there. And when you're there, just gaze at his beauty. Gaze at who he is. Look unto him steadily and intently, absorbing each and everything he gives you, aspiring to be more like him, to be changed, to be transformed by him, and just receiving those revelations as he gives you of who he is. And then last thing was inquire of him. Once you're in his presence, once you're there, you can inquire of him. Now so just one more thing and then I'll finish. So we've talked about being in God's presence, but in the heading of this video I had talked about how to ascend into God's presence, how to get there, how to get into his presence. So as humans, the Bible says we fall short of his glory. We have fallen short of his glory. So there are things that we've done in our lives that separate us from God. So one of the things that so there's a psalm here that tells us how we can approach God's presence. If you really want to be in His presence, dwell there, gazing at His beauty, inquiring of Him, then there are some things that we ourselves have to do. There are some things that we ought to fulfill. There are some things that we ought to do on our part to make sure that we can dwell in His presence. Remember, God is holy. God is holy, and being in His presence means you are in His holy presence. So there are things that we ought to make sure that we are doing so that we can maintain His presence. So let me read this scripture, and then I'll finish with this, and it'll make a lot more sense of what I'm talking about. So it's going to be Psalms 24 from verse 4. Psalms 24 from verse 4. So it says, "Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in His holy place?" Those are very good questions. Those are the questions we're trying to address today. Who may ascend to the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in His holy place? Here we go. Verse number 4. "The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, the one who has not appealed toward his faults." Another version says, "the one who has not appealed to a false idol." And then it says, "and the one who has not sworn deceitfully." So the one who has clean hands, pure heart, has not appealed to any idol, and has not sworn deceitfully. So clean hands, pure heart. You haven't bowed down to any idols. Now the idols nowadays, when you talk about idols, we're not talking about carved images. Those are still idols, yes. But in our days, it can be anything that you have exalted above the Lord. Anything that's so important in your life that is not as important as the Lord. That's your idol today. So what is it that you spend most time with, or takes time from Him? What is it that you value so much that it seems to take the first place in your life? That is your idol. And the one who has not sworn deceitfully. So lying and taking false oaths. If you focus on those things, then you'll be able to enter and dwell in His presence. Now to finish, let me read verse 5 and verse 6, because I think those two verses will summarize everything that I've talked about today. Verse 5 says, "He will receive," so the person who has clean hands, pure heart, has not appealed to any idol, has not sworn deceitfully. Verse 5 says, "He will receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from God of his salvation." He will receive a blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Verse number 6. Listen carefully. This is my favorite part. It's going to tie everything together that we talked about today. Verse number 6 says, "Such is the generation of those who inquire of Him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob." Such is the generation of those who inquire of Him, who seek the face of God of Jacob. Such is the generation. So what generation is it talking about? The generation that has clean hands, that keeps clean hands, pure hearts, does not bow down to idols or exalt anything above Him, and does not take oaths, does not swear deceitfully or lie. Such is the generation of those who inquire of Him, those who seek the face of God of Jacob. So if you do those things, you are such a generation. Those people who can now approach His throne, approach His presence, and inquire of Him, and seek His face. I hope this has been helpful. God bless you. See you next time.